The Biden administration is, for now, declining to offer nearly 400,000 Nicaraguan migrants a chance to live and work in the United States legally under the Temporary Protected Status Program. It's due in part to concerns that this may trigger a spike in border crossings. This comes after the administration announced Tuesday that it would extend the temporary legal status of more than 300,000 immigrants whose deportation protections were targeted by the Trump administration. The extension will allow existing TPS holders from El Salvador, Honduras, Nepal, and Nicaragua to continue living in the United States for 18 months. But the program will remain closed to new applicants. For more on this, I'm joined by CBS News immigration reporter Camilo Montoya-Galvez. Camilo, help us understand what I just said, because on the one hand, it's not allowing some in and is allowing others in. What's the distinction?
Good evening, John. Temporary protected status, for our audience, is a policy dating back to 1990 that allows the Department of Homeland Security to grant work permits and deportation protections to immigrants and migrants from countries experiencing a crisis, such as an environmental disaster, John, or an armed conflict. And the Trump administration really did not like this program because they believe that prior administrations had abused this policy, and so it moved to terminate a lot of these programs, including for the 4 countries that you mentioned. This week, the Biden administration fully reversed that decision, John, and extended the TPS programs for these 4 countries: El Salvador, Honduras, Nepal, and Nicaragua. But importantly, John, the administration decided not to expand eligibility for these programs, and so they remain closed to new applicants. And sources tell CBS News, John, that the reason that the Biden administration decided against expanding TPS eligibility to hundreds of thousands of migrants already here in the U.S. is because of concerns that doing so would trigger a massive spike in migration along the border, despite the fact, John, that a TPS program does not benefit people who are not already here in the U.S. But that is the administration's concern. They have managed to keep the level of illegal border crossings relatively low compared to earlier this year and last year, and they do not want to jeopardize that, John.
So help me understand that. If the temporary protected program doesn't affect those who are not here, is this just heightened sensitivity for them about the inducements? Because, of course, one of the immigration arguments, as you know, has been this idea that laws encourage migration. And then, of course, the other argument is that they're pushed from the conditions in the countries from which they come. Is there a hypersensitivity here about the temporary protected status program, or is it something else?
That is the question at the center of this debate, John. Despite the fact that TPS only applies to migrants and immigrants who are already here on U.S. soil, over the past few years, officials in the government have expressed concern that any type of generous immigration policy announcement and program will nevertheless act as a pull factor that encourages migration to the U.S.-Mexico border. Because even though migrants don't technically qualify for these programs because they're outside of the U.S., smugglers might tell them otherwise, that they actually do qualify for these programs, or they might misunderstand U.S. policy. Right. And right now, the administration is launching a concerted effort, John, to try to keep these numbers at the border down, and they don't want to disrupt that by any means.
Right, because they feel like they're succeeding, and the numbers would seem to suggest that at some level. But what happens then, Camilo, after 18 months? What happens then?
Well, that is the longstanding problem with temporary protected status. I just emphasize the temporary. This program does not allow recipients to get a green card, to get permanent status here or U.S. citizenship. So administrations either have to extend that status, or these people have to find another way to get legal here, quote unquote. If the Biden administration is reelected, if President Biden is reelected, I assume the administration will move to extend those programs for another 18 months. But if a Trump administration or a DeSantis administration, if you will, take power in 2025, I assume that these programs will be terminated or at least limited significantly, and these people will be subject to deportation unless they find a way, again, to get permanent status here. Efforts in Congress to legalize this population, just like efforts to legalize the so-called dreamer population, have been cut up in this broader gridlock in Congress, John, because right now Republicans do not want to legalize any subset of the immigrant population here unless there are significant restrictions on asylum along the U.S.-Mexico border. And that is the current stalemate. And I don't think we will see any changes to that situation anytime soon, John.
Indeed. Camilo Montoya-Galvez, thank you so much.
Of course.